The stagecoach hit a rut in the road so hard that Vivian Hale's travel bag slid off the bench and landed squarely on her foot. She didn't curse. She didn't cry. She just reached down, picked the bag up, set it back in her lap, and stared out the window at a landscape that looked like it had been scraped raw by something angry and left to dry in the sun. West Texas in October was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined open sky, rolling grassland, maybe the kind of wide golden horizon that sounded poetic when people wrote about it in letters. What she saw instead was red dirt, scrub brush, a few scraggly trees that looked half dead even in autumn, and dust. So much dust that it seeped in through the gaps in the coach doors and settled on her dark skirt like pale powder. There were two other passengers. A heavy-set man in a merchant's coat who had fallen asleep against the far wall and snored steadily with his mouth open. And a younger woman, perhaps 25, wearing a bonnet and clutching a carpet bag with both hands, who had introduced herself as Margaret and then said almost nothing else for the last 4 hours. Vivian didn't mind the quiet. She had learned, in the past 8 months, to stop filling silence with words just to keep herself company. The silence was there. It didn't need filling. It just needed enduring. She was 43 years old, and she had exactly $11.60 to her name. She tried not to think about that. She thought about it anyway. But Red Hollow was not a large town. It had one main street, 2 saloons positioned at either end like bookends, a general store, a feed merchant, a small post office with a warped door that didn't close all the way, a barber shop, and a jail. There were a few side streets with houses tucked behind them, a church that needed painting, and a livery stable that smelled the way all livery stables smelled everywhere in the world, which was to say powerfully and without apology. The stagecoach pulled in just past 2 in the afternoon. The driver called the stop, and the heavy-set merchant woke with a snort and began gathering his things. Margaret thanked Vivian for the company, even though they'd barely spoken, and then they all stepped out onto the packed earth of the main street and went their separate ways. Vivian stood on the boardwalk outside the stage depot and looked at the town. A man leaning against a post nearby noticed her noticing and said, "You passing through or staying?" "Staying," she said, "for the time being." He looked at her bag. He looked at her dress, which was clean but worn. He looked at her face, which was, she knew, too composed for someone who had nothing but $11 and a job offer in a letter that was 3 weeks old. "Where you headed?" he asked. "Iron Ridge Ranch." The man's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. It wasn't alarm exactly. It was closer to the look someone gave when they saw a person about to do something inadvisable, but weren't sure they were in a position to offer advice. "Blackwood's place," he said. "That's the one." He nodded slowly. "You the new cook?" "I hope to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he tipped his hat and said, "Good luck to you, ma'am," in a tone that implied luck was the primary ingredient she'd be needing. She found lodging for the night at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Draper, who was 60-something, wire-thin, and ran her establishment with the quiet authority of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. The room cost 50 cents. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out on the alley behind the saloon, and nothing else. Vivian washed her face and hands and went down to the small dining room for supper. There were 4 other boarders at the table. She listened more than she talked. She learned the names of the nearby ranches, the current price of beef on the hoof, the fact that there had been a dry summer and the grass was thinner than usual, and, most relevantly, she learned considerably more about Iron Ridge Ranch than she had known before she sat down. "Blackwood's been going through cooks like a man going through boot heels," said one of the boarders, a rail worker named Connolly, who had the red-brown complexion of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "Had 4 this year alone, I heard. Maybe 5. "What happens to them?" asked another boarder, a young man whose name Vivian had already forgotten. "Nothing dramatic," Connolly said, cutting his bread. "They just quit. Man's not easy to work for. Not easy to be around. The hands all say the same thing. He's not cruel. Not exactly. He just doesn't—" He searched for the word. "Engage. Treats the whole operation like a machine he needs to keep running. No conversation, no acknowledgement, barely a word that isn't an order or a correction." "Something happened to him," Mrs. Draper said from the doorway. She wasn't being coy about it. She stated it the way you'd state a fact about the weather. Lost his wife and boy some years back. Fever took both of them inside of a week. People said he was never quite the same after. The table went quiet in the way it did when something true and heavy had been said, and nobody had an appropriate response. Vivian cut a piece of potato and ate it. She kept her eyes on her plate. She had lost her husband too, but she had not had the luxury of retreating into silence and distance. She'd had debts to manage, and a house to lose, and a future to claw back from the ground with her bare hands. Grief was real, she knew. But grief was not the only thing that was real. She didn't say any of this. She finished her supper and went to bed. Eat. The next morning she hired a man with a wagon to take her out to Iron Ridge, which was roughly 9 miles southeast of town, along a road that became progressively less of a road the farther from Red Hollow they traveled. The driver, a leathery old man named Pete, who had delivered goods out to the ranch for years, was more talkative than she needed him to be at 7 in the morning. But she let him talk. "Big place," he said. "One of the biggest in this part of the territory. Runs maybe 4,000 head, give or take. Got 30-odd cowboys on the payroll, maybe more at roundup time. Blackwood's family built it up from almost nothing. His daddy started it, and Wyatt took it over and doubled it. Man knows cattle, man knows land, man knows business." A pause. "What he doesn't know anymore is people." "How long since his wife died?" Vivian asked. Pete calculated. 6 years, 7 maybe. The boy was about 8 years old when it happened. It was a bad season. Fever ran through several families in the valley. Most people lost somebody. Blackwood lost everybody. Vivian looked at the scrubland passing on either side of the wagon. An eagle or a hawk, she couldn't tell which, turned slow circles in the pale morning sky overhead. "Ranch hands staying on?" she asked. "For now. They're loyal to Iron Ridge, most of them. Loyal to what it was. Some of them been there since Blackwood's father's time." Pete shook his head. "But morale's a quiet thing. You can't always see it draining until there's nothing left." She thought about that. They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence. Iron Ridge Ranch came into view gradually, the way big things often did. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until suddenly you were looking at the whole of it and realizing it was larger than you'd understood. First the fencing, miles of it, cedar posts and wire, running along the road. Then the cattle, distant clusters of them grazing on the dry autumn grass. Then the outbuildings, a long bunkhouse, a large barn, a separate stable, smaller storage buildings, and finally the main house itself, sitting on a slight rise, 2 stories, built from the kind of heavy dark timber that announced permanence. It was handsome, in a functional way. Not ornate. Not the kind of house that wanted to be admired. The kind of house that had been built to last and had lasted and was going to keep lasting whether anyone admired it or not. Pete pulled the wagon up to the main house and set the brake. A ranch hand nearby looked up from what he was doing and straightened when he saw the wagon. "New cook?" he asked. "That's her," Pete said. The ranch hand, young, maybe 20, with a sunburned face and a serious expression, came over and took his hat off with an awkward formality that suggested he didn't perform the gesture very often. "Ma'am, I'm Danny Rowe. I can take your bag." "Thank you, Danny," she said. "Is Mr. Blackwood available?" Danny's expression did something complicated. "He's out on the South Range this morning. The foreman, Mr. Greer, is here, though. He handles the hiring." She thanked Pete, paid him the agreed 30 cents, and followed Danny toward a smaller building beside the main house. The kitchen, she quickly realized, which was connected to the main house by a covered walkway, but was its own structure. Danny knocked at the door of the adjacent office, and a moment later Vivian was standing in front of Franklin Greer. The foreman was around 50, broad through the chest, with a gray mustache and the steady eyes of someone accustomed to assessing things quickly and accurately. He looked at Vivian the way Pete's wagon horses might look at an unfamiliar road. Not unfriendly, just measuring. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "you made it." "I did." "Sit down." He gestured to a plain wooden chair across from his desk. She sat. "You answered the advertisement we placed in 3 papers. You're the only one who replied." She had suspected this but hadn't been certain. "I see," she said. "Previous cook left 5 weeks ago. Before that, we went through a woman who lasted 8 days, and a man before her who lasted almost 3 months before he decided he'd rather work the cattle lines than keep cooking for a man who never said thank you. Greer said this without accusation, just as a recitation of fact. I want to be straight with you about what you're coming into. I'd appreciate that. He leaned back in his chair. The work itself is not complicated in terms of the cooking, though there's more of it than you might expect. You'll be feeding the main house and the bunkhouse both. Breakfast before dawn, dinner at midday, supper in the evening. Cowboys eat a lot. The bunkhouse has 27 men on the regular payroll right now. During peak season, that goes up to 40 or more. He paused. There's a girl, Alma, who helps in the kitchen. She's good at peeling and hauling, but she's young and not a strong cook on her own. You'll have her as help. That's fine, Vivian said. The harder part, Greer continued, is the house. You'll take your meals with the crew, but you'll be responsible for cooking for Mr. Blackwood separately. Or rather, for laying the table at the main house. He eats alone most evenings, doesn't join the men. He stopped. Then he added, more carefully, he's not a difficult man in the way that some employers are difficult. He doesn't lose his temper. He doesn't make unreasonable demands. He's just... He seemed to choose the word deliberately. Remote. Remote, she repeated. You can do good work here and never once feel like he noticed. That bothers some people more than they expect. Vivian thought about this. She thought about 8 months of grief nobody had particularly noticed or acknowledged. She thought about closing up a house and selling furniture and writing letters to creditors and doing all of it without a single person remarking that she was managing remarkably well for someone whose world had just collapsed. I'm not easily bothered, she said. Greer studied her. Then he nodded, once, as if something had been decided. Wages are $12 a month, room and board included. Your quarters are behind the kitchen, a private room, small but yours. He stood and extended his hand. Welcome to Iron Ridge Ranch, Mrs. Hale. She shook it. The kitchen was large by any standard she'd worked in, which helped immediately. A big cast iron range that looked like it had been manufactured somewhere expensive and shipped a very long distance. Good counter space, a root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the floor, dry storage along one wall, a pump at the sink that actually worked, which was a luxury she hadn't expected, and a window over the counter that looked out at the south yard and the far edge of the stable, with enough light in the afternoon to work by without straining her eyes. Alma was 17, dark-haired, and very quiet in the way that some young people were quiet. Not shy exactly, but watchful. She'd been at the ranch for 2 years, she said, since her family had moved to the area from further south. She could bake bread, she said, and she could make a reasonable biscuit. Can you make gravy? Vivian asked. Alma considered this with unusual seriousness. Sometimes it comes out right. That's honest, Vivian said. We'll work on it. The first meal she made at Iron Ridge Ranch was supper on her first day, which gave her approximately 4 hours to figure out what was in the stores, what the range could do, and what 27 hungry men expected when they sat down at the bunkhouse table. What she found in the stores was adequate but uninspired. Salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, canned goods, some onions that were still good, a sack of potatoes, dried peppers, flour in quantity, lard, coffee, a great deal of coffee, which told her something about the priorities of the operation. She made a big pot of beans cooked down with salt pork and onion and dried pepper until the liquid was thick and fragrant rather than watery. She made cornbread in 2 large cast iron pans. She made a simple gravy from the drippings. She did it herself and let Alma watch. And she made a pot of strong coffee. It wasn't extraordinary. It was straightforward, solid cooking. But when the men came in from the day's work and sat down and she set it on the table, the bunkhouse went quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of displeasure, but the quiet of people paying attention to what they were eating for the first time in a while. One of the cowboys, older, weathered, with a drooping gray mustache, looked up after his first few spoonfuls and said, "What did you put in these beans?" "Onion and pepper," Vivian said, "and enough thyme." He nodded. He went back to eating. Beside him, another man said something in a low voice, and the first man replied, and then there was a quiet sound that Vivian realized, after a moment, was laughter. It was a small thing. She filed it away. She met Wyatt Blackwood for the first time the following morning at breakfast. She had been up since before 4. She'd made biscuits, real ones, with enough fat to be flaky, and she'd made a pan of scrambled eggs with the last of the fresh eggs from the coop, and she'd cooked a thick strip of bacon alongside, and had coffee on before the sky was fully light. She laid the main house table for one, the way Greer had told her it would be, and waited. He came in at 5:30. Vivian had formed some expectation of what he might look like, based on everything she'd heard. She'd imagined someone visibly worn down, someone whose grief was legible on him in the way grief sometimes was, in the slope of the shoulders, the dullness of the eyes, the sense of a person who was present in body but traveling somewhere else in mind. What she saw instead was a man who was, physically, fully intact. He was perhaps 48 or 50, tall and lean, with the rangy build of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and he hadn't shaved in several days. He wore a plain work shirt, canvas trousers, and boots that were well made, but scuffed from use. He came into the dining room and stopped when he saw her. Just stopped, briefly, in the doorway. "You're the new cook," he said. "Vivian Hale," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." He looked at the table. He looked at the food. He pulled out the chair and sat down. He said nothing else. She poured his coffee and withdrew to the kitchen. She listened from the kitchen to the sounds of a man eating, the small clatter of utensils, the ceramic sound of a cup being set down. She didn't hover. She didn't go back in to ask if everything was acceptable. After about 15 minutes, she heard him push back his chair and walk to the door. And then, very briefly, she heard his footsteps pause. He said nothing. The footsteps continued. The front door opened and closed. She went in and cleared the table. He had eaten everything. The weeks settled into a rhythm, though rhythm was perhaps too orderly a word for what the first few weeks actually were. Chaotic would be closer. Not in any dramatic sense. There were no crises in those early weeks, no disasters. But the simple logistics of feeding that many people 3 times a day with an assistant who was still learning and stores that needed reorganizing, and a range that had its own particular quirks and moods, required the kind of sustained, grinding effort that left her back aching and her feet sore every night when she finally sat down in her small room behind the kitchen. She didn't complain. There was nobody to complain to, and she wasn't inclined to do it anyway. What she discovered slowly was the specific shape of the ranch's hunger. Not just physical hunger, though that was prodigious. Cowboys doing hard physical labor all day developed a caloric need that was almost industrial, but a hunger of a different kind. These were men who spent their days largely in silence, doing hard, repetitive work in difficult conditions, and who came in at mealtimes needing something that was more than fuel, even if they couldn't have said so. She started small, a little more care with the seasoning, a pot of something that smelled good all afternoon and let the smell drift across the yard. A batch of molasses cookies one Sunday morning, just because she found molasses in the back of the dry stores and the men looked like they could use something sweet. She left them in a crock on the bunkhouse table. By mid-morning, the crock was empty, and 2 men she hadn't spoken to before came to the kitchen door to say they'd been good. "Thank you," she said. The older cowboy with the gray mustache, his name was Hatch, she'd learned, and he'd been at Iron Ridge for 11 years, lingered a moment after the other man had gone. "Previous cook," he said, "made beans that tasted like wet cardboard." "Most things do when you don't salt them properly," Vivian said. He gave a short bark of a laugh. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and walked off. She didn't let herself feel too encouraged. One good moment didn't build a future. She'd learned that the hard way, but she noted it. The mornings at the main house were their own particular challenge. She cooked for Wyatt Blackwood 6 days a week. Sundays he ate with the hands, at Greer's insistence apparently, though he did so without conversation and left promptly after finishing. Every morning she set the table, every morning he came in and ate, and every morning the exchange between them consisted of a greeting from her and silence from him. On the 9th morning, she set down a plate of fried potatoes alongside the eggs and biscuits, and he looked at it and said, "I don't like fried potatoes." "I'll remember that," she said. She didn't apologize, she didn't explain, she just noted it and left. The next morning she made hash instead. Same potato, cooked differently. He ate it without comment, which she chose to interpret as acceptance. On the 14th morning he said, "The biscuits are better than the last cook's." "Thank you," she said. The coffee's stronger than I'd like. I can adjust it. He nodded and went back to eating. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a moment with her back to the door, and she allowed herself a small private acknowledgement that this was, in its limited way, progress. 2 sentences was more than she'd gotten in 2 weeks. It was Hatch who gave her the most useful thing anyone told her in her first month at Iron Ridge. He found her in the kitchen one evening after supper when she was going over a list she'd made of supplies that needed ordering before winter. He knocked on the doorframe and she told him to come in, and he sat down at the corner of her work table with the ease of someone who'd been in kitchens all his life. "You're making it," he said. She looked up. "Am I?" "You're still here. That's making it, for this place." He folded his hands on the table. Previous cook left a note when she went, just left it on the kitchen counter, said she'd never worked somewhere so empty. Vivian thought about that word. Empty. It was precise, she thought. Not cruel or violent or even neglectful, just empty. "What was the ranch like before?" she asked. "Before Mrs. Blackwood died?" Hatch was quiet for a moment. He wasn't reluctant exactly, more like he was finding the right words. "Different," he said finally. Ellie Blackwood. She was a particular kind of person. She could talk to anybody. Ranch hands, cattle buyers, other ranchers' wives who thought they were better than her. Didn't matter. She'd just talk to them, and by the end they'd told her their whole life story. He paused. She used to come out to the bunkhouse sometimes, just to check in, bring something she'd baked, ask if anyone needed anything. He rubbed the back of his neck. After she was gone, Wyatt just folded in on himself. Can't blame him. He loved her. He loved that boy. He stopped. But the ranch felt it. "It still feels it," Vivian said, not critically, just observing. "Yes, ma'am," Hatch said. "It still does." He left not long after. Vivian sat at the table alone for a while, looking at her supply list and not really seeing it. She understood grief. She understood it from the inside. She knew how it could make the rest of the world seem very thin and very far away, like looking at everything through a fogged window. She knew how you could go through the motions of daily life, could eat and work and speak, and still be mostly somewhere else. But she also knew, because she'd been through it, that there was a point where the fog either started to clear or it became the only weather you'd ever have. And she thought, looking at what she'd seen of Wyatt Blackwood in 2 weeks, that he had made his peace with the fog, that he had stopped expecting clear air. That, she thought, was the real problem. Not the grief itself. The decision, somewhere along the way, to stop fighting the fog. She wasn't here to fight it for him. That wasn't her place, and she knew it. She was here to cook, and to stay long enough to do the job properly, and to earn her $12 a month, and her small room, and her meals. But she was also here, and she had spent too much of her own life learning that choosing to stay present was a daily decision, not a single grand gesture to ignore what she was seeing. The first real conversation she had with Wyatt Blackwood happened by accident, in the kitchen, on a Thursday morning in early November. She had been up since before 4 as usual, but the fire in the range had burned low overnight, and she was coaxing it back when she heard the back door open. She straightened and turned, and he was standing in the kitchen doorway, not the door from the house, but the outside door, the one that opened onto the covered walkway. He looked at her. He looked at the range. He said, "The fire go out?" "Low," she said. "Not out. I've almost got it." He came in without being invited, which startled her, but which she decided not to remark on. He crouched down in front of the range and looked at what she'd done with it, and then he said, "Move that front log to the left. The draft's better on that side." She was going to tell him she had it, but something made her hold the response and just do what he said. She moved the log. The fire responded almost immediately. The flames steadied and grew, and within a minute the range was burning cleanly. She straightened up. He straightened up. They were standing approximately 3 feet apart in her kitchen in the dark of early morning, and she realized it was the closest she'd been to him in almost 3 weeks. "Elbow of the flue is a little warped," he said, looking at the range rather than at her. "When the wind comes from the north, it pulls the draft the wrong way. Greer's been meaning to have it fixed." "I'll remember that when the wind shifts," she said. He nodded. He looked like he was going to leave, and then he didn't. He stood there for a moment and she busied herself with the coffee, measuring grounds by feel, putting the pot on. "You're from Missouri," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "How did you know that?" "The way you said warped. Vowels different out here." She almost smiled. "Joplin," she said. "Originally, I've lived in several places since." "What brought you to Red Hollow?" She measured another scoop of grounds, taking her time about it. "The same thing that brings most people to places like Red Hollow," she said. "Fewer options elsewhere." He absorbed this without comment. Then he said, "There was an advertisement." "Yes. You were the only one who responded." "Mr. Greer mentioned that." A pause. He looked at the window, though it was still dark outside and there was nothing to see. "That doesn't concern you?" She set the coffee pot on the range. "Should it?" He didn't answer that. He left without another word, going back through the outside door the way he'd come. She heard his boots on the walkway, and then silence. She stood in her kitchen and finished making breakfast, and she thought, 2 sentences yesterday, 10 today. It wasn't nothing. Well, by the end of November, she had made the kitchen something different than it had been when she arrived. Not physically different, she hadn't rearranged the furniture or repainted the walls. But a kitchen was as much about what happened in it as about what it looked like, and what happened in her kitchen now was different. Alma had loosened up enough to talk while they worked. Hatch occasionally stopped by in the afternoons with some excuse or other, something that needed relaying to the kitchen, a question about the supply order, and stayed to talk. A couple of the younger cowboys had figured out that if they had a genuine question about food, how to cook something over a fire on the range, whether something in the bunkhouse stores had gone off, Vivian would answer them seriously and without condescension. It was small, but the kitchen had become the kind of place people wanted to be near. The bunkhouse changed too, though slowly. Better food meant better meals, and better meals meant the men sat together longer in the evenings instead of dispersing immediately after eating. Conversation accumulated in the way it does when there is enough warmth and enough time, slowly, in layers, like sediment. She heard laughter from the bunkhouse one evening in late November and paused at the window to listen to it for a moment. She hadn't heard laughter from the bunkhouse before. Not like that. Not easy and unself-conscious. She didn't take credit for it. Men who worked hard and ate well found their own laughter eventually. She'd just created conditions where it could happen. But she did allow herself to stand at the window for a moment and feel that she had contributed something worth contributing. Wyatt Blackwood was still difficult. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He was not unkind. He did not raise his voice, did not make unreasonable demands, did not treat her with contempt. But there was something in him that resisted engagement the way a locked door resisted a key. Every conversation felt like a negotiation she hadn't known she was entering. He would speak in short sentences, answer questions with the minimum necessary information, and exit rooms at the precise moment that conversation might have become something warmer. She noticed that he moved through his own house like a guest in it, like someone who had forgotten they were allowed to be comfortable there. She noticed he still had photographs of his family on the wall in the hallway. She'd seen them once, walking through to check on something in the root cellar. But the hallway was dark, and she couldn't see them clearly, and she didn't stop to look. She noticed, because she was observant, and she couldn't help it, that he was most present in the early morning and most withdrawn in the evening, that he worked long days and pushed himself hard, that he read. She saw books in the small study she glimpsed through an open door once, and the books looked red, genuinely red, not decorative, that he cared about the cattle in a way that was specific and detailed and did not seem abstract to him. She noticed all of this, and she did not draw conclusions from it. She cooked his meals. She adjusted the coffee strength. She stopped making fried potatoes. She made sure the biscuits were consistent because consistency, she'd learned, was its own form of trust. And one evening, in the first week of December, she came in to clear the supper table at the main house and found that he was still sitting there. He wasn't eating. The plate was clear. He was just sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold, looking at nothing. She came in quietly and began clearing. She didn't say anything. She reached past him for the bread plate, and her sleeve brushed the edge of the table, and he looked up as if he'd forgotten she was coming. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "I'll be out of your way in a moment," she said. "No!" He stopped. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her directly, and it was the most directly he'd looked at her in 6 weeks. "The meal tonight, the stew." She waited. "It was good," he said. "The whole month has been good." She was so surprised that for a moment she didn't respond. Then she said simply, "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." He nodded and looked back at his coffee. She finished clearing and went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the sink with her hands in the dishwater and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but was something in between. Outside, through the kitchen window, the Texas sky was packed with stars in the way it could be, out here, far from the lights of any town, so dense with them that it looked almost solid. She stood there for a moment and just looked at it. Then she finished the dishes and went to bed. The stars she'd stood watching through the kitchen window that December night were the last clear ones for a while. By the following morning, a cold front had moved in from the north, dragging with it a low gray ceiling of cloud that settled over the valley and refused to leave. The temperature dropped fast, the way it could in Texas, even in early winter. Not the sustained, brutal cold of the northern states, but a sharp, cutting cold that made itself known through gaps in clothing and walls alike, and that the ranch hands greeted with the resigned irritability of men who knew they'd still be working in it regardless. Vivian built the fire in the range higher and started adding warmer things to the meals. Thick soups, more bread, a beef broth she kept simmering on the back of the range so the kitchen stayed warm through the afternoon and the smell drifted out into the yard. Practical decisions, all of them. But the men noticed. Of course they noticed. Cold made you notice warmth in ways you didn't bother with in comfortable weather. Hatch told her one afternoon that the bunkhouse felt different. She was cutting onions at the time, a task she'd long since stopped minding, though her eyes still responded the same way regardless. And she didn't look up when he said it. "Different how?" she said. "Louder," he said. Not in a bad way, just men talking more, sitting together longer after supper. He pulled out a stool at the end of the work table and sat on it uninvited, which she'd come to understand was simply his way. Morrison told a story last night about a drive he did up in Kansas 6 years ago. First time I'd heard Morrison tell a story. Man's been here 3 years. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "People talk when they're comfortable," she said. "That's all that is." "Maybe," Hatch said, "but comfort doesn't happen by accident." She didn't respond to that because she didn't want to have a conversation about herself. She pushed the onions aside and reached for the next one. Hatch stayed anyway, the way he tended to, and after a moment he said more quietly, "How's it going at the main house?" It wasn't entirely a question. She understood what he was actually asking. "Fine," she said. "He say anything to you?" "He complimented the stew last week." Hatch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That might be the longest compliment he's given anyone in 2 years." She laughed. A short, real sound, not the social kind. "That's a low bar, Hatch." "It is," he agreed. "But it's further than the bar was." And December at Iron Ridge Ranch moved slowly and coldly, and with a great deal of work underneath the surface that wasn't particularly visible from the outside. Cattle had to be checked and moved and supplemented with feed when the grass thinned. Fencing that had been borderline all summer became urgent when the cold came and the wood contracted. The horses needed extra attention. The equipment needed maintenance before the harder weather. Vivian watched all of this from her kitchen, through her window, in the margins of the hours that were not consumed by the actual cooking. She understood the rhythm of a working ranch the way she'd come to understand a great many things she'd had no reason to know before, by proximity and attention. She'd had no special training in ranch life. Her late husband, Daniel, had been a dry goods merchant. She'd learned kitchens not from any formal instruction, but from necessity and repetition and a willingness to make mistakes and adjust. It occurred to her sometimes, in the early mornings before the ranch woke up, how different her life might have looked if Daniel hadn't died. She tried not to dwell in that particular direction for too long because it led nowhere useful, but the thought came anyway, that she might have spent the rest of her days behind a counter in Joplin, or in a larger city if Daniel's business had grown the way he'd hoped, and she would never have seen this particular sky or learned the specific silence of a Texas winter morning or stood in a kitchen making biscuits while 30 men slept in a bunkhouse 50 yards away. She didn't know if that would have been better or worse. She suspected it would just have been different. Different wasn't better or worse. It was just the other road. She made the biscuits. She drank her first cup of coffee while they baked, standing at the window watching the dark sky begin its slow gray, reluctant brightening in the east. She thought about the day's meals, which was practical and kept her mind from going further down roads that led nowhere. Botzik. She had been at Iron Ridge for almost 2 months when the incident with the ledger happened. It was not dramatic at the time. It became significant later, in the way that small moments sometimes did. Not because of what they were, but because of where they led. Wyatt had left a ledger on the dining room table. She came in to clear the breakfast things and found it lying open alongside his empty plate, as if he'd been reviewing it while he ate and had been called away before finishing. She picked it up to move it off the table and set it on the sideboard. She didn't mean to look at it, but she was the kind of person who looked at things, who noticed numbers the same way she noticed flavors, automatically and without deciding to. And the column of figures she saw in the brief moment before she set it down made something in the back of her mind register. The addition was wrong. She set the book on the sideboard. She went back to clearing the table. She didn't say anything. It wasn't her place. It was almost certainly a ledger she wasn't meant to have seen at all. And more likely than not, she'd misread it in the half-second she'd had it in her hands. She'd leave it alone. She left it alone for 4 days. On the 5th day, carrying a tray of dinner things through the hall, she stopped in front of the sideboard where the ledger still sat, uncollected, apparently forgotten, and she stood there for a long moment with the tray in her hands. Then she went back to the kitchen, set the tray down, walked back to the hall, picked up the ledger, opened it, and looked at the numbers properly. The addition was wrong, not by a small amount, by a very significant amount. A column of quarterly expenses that should have totaled somewhere around $2,400 had been summed as $1,800 and something. The difference had been carried forward into subsequent calculations, which meant the error multiplied across the following pages. She wasn't an accountant. She had no formal training in bookkeeping. But Daniel had kept books for his store, and she had helped him often enough to understand how a ledger was supposed to work and how the numbers were supposed to relate to each other. She stood in the hall with the ledger open in her hands for a long moment. Then she put it back exactly where she'd found it and went back to the kitchen. She told herself it was not her concern. She almost believed it. Wyatt came in for dinner at midday in his usual way, direct from the yard, stamping mud from his boots at the door, moving with the efficiency of someone who treated the meal as a task to complete rather than an event to participate in. She set the plate in front of him and was going back to the kitchen when she heard herself say, against her better judgment, "Mr. Blackwood." He looked up. She stood in the doorway between the dining room and the hall. She had not planned to say what she was about to say. She said it anyway. "The ledger on the sideboard. I moved it this morning when I was clearing. I noticed something in it, in the quarterly expense column." She stopped. "I may have misread it. It was a brief look." He was very still. His expression had not changed, which was its own response. "What did you notice?" he said. "The quarterly expenses. The column doesn't add up to the figure at the bottom." She paused. "It's about $600 off, as near as I could see." He looked at her for a moment without any particular readable expression. Then he pushed back his chair and went to the hall. She heard the rustle of pages. The silence that followed was longer than she expected. Then he came back to the doorway. He was looking at the ledger, not at her. His jaw was set in a way it hadn't been before. "The cook before you," he said, slowly, as if choosing each word, "is also the one who kept this account." Vivian said nothing. He looked up from the ledger. His eyes were hard. "How long have you been looking at my books?" "I haven't been," she said. "I moved it this morning to clear the table. The page was open. I couldn't help seeing the numbers." She held her ground. "I should have said something sooner. I considered not saying anything at all. I decided that wasn't right." He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then he looked back down at the ledger. "The error goes further back," he said. It wasn't to her. It was almost to himself. "I didn't look beyond the quarterly page," she said. "I thought that was already more than I should have done." He didn't respond to that. He stood in the doorway with the ledger open in his hand, looking at figures that were apparently compounding themselves in his mind into something significantly larger than a cook's errand, and she took that as her cue to withdraw. She went back to the kitchen. She heard him, some time later, leave the dining room and go to the study. The study door closed, not loudly, but firmly. She finished cleaning up the kitchen and started on the preparations for supper, and did not think about what she'd done or what it might mean. There was no point in thinking about it. She'd said what she had to say. The rest of it was his. What she hadn't anticipated was that telling him would mark a change in how he related to her. Not a dramatic change. Nothing about Wyatt Blackwood was dramatic, at least not on the surface. But after that afternoon, there was a subtle shift. He started speaking more at breakfast. Not extensively. He was still a man of few words by any standard, but more than before. He would make a comment about the weather or about the day's work, or occasionally ask a direct question that had an answer beyond yes or no. On the first Monday of January, he came into breakfast and sat down and said, "You were a merchant's wife in Joplin." She'd mentioned Joplin once, weeks ago, in the dark of the early morning when the fire had needed fixing. She was mildly surprised he remembered. "I was," she said. "You kept accounts for the store?" "Helped with them. Not formally trained." He ate a biscuit. He looked at the window, which was still dark. "The ledger problem goes back 14 months, he said. "Greer's going to look at everything from the past 2 years. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and meant it, though she wasn't sure sorry was quite right. Relieved, maybe, was what he should be. Catching a problem was better than not catching it. But this didn't seem like the moment to make that particular point. "Don't be sorry," he said, in a tone that wasn't harsh but was matter-of-fact. "You caught it." He finished his breakfast and left. She stood at the kitchen counter with a dishcloth in her hand and thought about the fact that he had just, in his extremely compressed and minimal way, said thank you. The most he'd said thank you for anything. She folded the dishcloth neatly and put it on the counter. January brought Greer to the kitchen more often, which was unusual. He was not a kitchen-haunting type of man. He had the foreman's innate distrust of any space that wasn't productive in an obvious physical way. But he came 3 times that first week, ostensibly for various ranch-related reasons. And on the third visit, he stayed long enough for her to pour him a cup of coffee and sit across from him at the work table. "How bad is it?" she said. Not a question. Greer wrapped both hands around the cup. "Bad enough," he said. "Not catastrophic, but bad enough that Wyatt's had to go into Red Hollow twice this week to meet with the bank." She let that sit for a moment. "The account error? Part of it? There are other things." He looked out the window at the winter yard where 2 ranch hands were moving a load of feed toward the barn. A ranch this size runs on credit as much as on cash. You're always in some relationship with the bank. When the books look wrong, the bank starts asking questions, and when they start asking questions, he stopped, shook his head. It creates its own problems, separate from whatever the original problem was. "Is the ranch in actual danger?" she asked. Greer looked at her. He seemed to be deciding how much to say to a woman who cooked his employer's meals and had no technical stake in the enterprise. Then he seemed to decide on balance that she'd earned something approaching candor. "Not immediate danger," he said. "But there are things that need to be corrected, and that's going to take time and some uncomfortable conversations." He drank his coffee. "Wyatt knows that. He's a capable man. He'll work through it." Then, more quietly, "He just hasn't had to deal with this kind of thing in a while. When Ellie was alive, she managed a lot of the business side. After she was gone, he just let it run itself, which is not the same as managing it." Vivian looked at her hands on the table. "He trusted the wrong person to keep the books." "He trusted whoever showed up and said they could," Greer said. "That's been the problem with this place for years. He stopped being particular about things. When you stop caring about the outcome, you stop being careful about the inputs." She said nothing. She understood what he was describing from the inside, the way grief worked itself out in neglect, in small surrenders that accumulated into large problems. She'd seen it in herself in the months after Daniel died, in the ways she'd stopped being careful about things that Daniel had cared about. Not from any decision, but from the blankness that descended and made careful attention feel almost physically impossible. The difference between her situation and Wyatt Blackwood's was that she hadn't had the option of letting things slide. The creditors hadn't allowed her that mercy. "He'll fix it," she said. "Yes," Greer said, "he will." He stood up, draining the last of the coffee. Question is, how much of himself he'll fix in the process. He left that thought in the kitchen and walked back out into the cold yard. February came in with actual warmth, the kind of false warmth that Texas sometimes produced in midwinter, as if apologizing for the previous month. A run of several days in the low 60s with clear sky and light wind that brought the ranch hands out of the bunkhouse in the evenings to sit on the steps and talk. Vivian opened the kitchen window for the first time in weeks and let the warmer air in while she worked. She had been at Iron Ridge Ranch for 3 months. She had not been fired or discouraged or demoralized, which felt like its own kind of accomplishment. She had made $202 worth of food from supplies that were never quite as good as she wanted them to be. She had taught Alma to make a gravy that came out right every time. She had accidentally become a kind of fixed point in the informal social geography of the ranch. The person you could bring a question to, or a problem that wasn't exactly a ranch problem, or just a bad mood that needed somewhere to sit for a while. She was aware that this was a strange thing for a cook to become, but she'd learned by now that on a place like Iron Ridge Ranch, which had been running on professional efficiency and emotional emptiness for years, a kitchen that was genuinely warm drew people the way a fire drew people in winter. Not because they were cold exactly, but because warmth reminded them that not being cold was possible. Danny Rowe, the young ranch hand who'd taken her bag on her first day, had taken to stopping by after his work was done in the evenings, sometimes to ask Alma something, and sometimes just because he'd figured out that the kitchen was a place where he could sit and not be required to be entirely competent. He was 21, she'd learned, and had come to the ranch from a difficult family situation that he described only in the vaguest possible terms. He was good with horses and bad at asking for help, which was a common combination in young men out here. One evening in mid-February, he came in looking like he'd had a hard day, which he had, though the hardness was not physical. She'd heard through the ranch's informal communication channels that he'd made a mistake with a gate on the South Range, and a small group of cattle had gotten into a neighboring pasture and had to be retrieved. Not a disaster, but the kind of mistake that lingered. He sat at the corner of the work table in Hatch's habitual spot and said nothing for a while. "Are you hungry?" Vivian asked. "No, ma'am." She was rolling dough and kept rolling it. "Hatch told me what happened with the South Gate." He was quiet. Then, "I know I closed it. I don't know how it came open." "The latch on the South Gate has been intermittent since November," she said. "Greer knows about it. He's had it on the repair list." Danny looked up. "Nobody told me that." "They should have. That's not your error. That's a communication failure." She pressed the dough flat with the rolling pin. "It happens on a ranch this size. Things that need fixing stay on lists, and people use the equipment not knowing the equipment isn't reliable." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Wyatt, Mr. Blackwood. He saw it happen. He was on the ridge. Did he say something to you?" "No, he just looked." She cut a circle of dough. She placed it in the pan. A man who doesn't say something when he's angry is not necessarily a man who isn't angry, she said, but a man who doesn't say something when he could have said something critical. That's also something. Danny thought about this. "He didn't say I was careless." "No," she said. "He didn't." The boy sat with that for a while. Then he said, "He's different lately, since—" He stopped. "Since what?" "Since you got here, I guess," he said. He sounded almost surprised to hear himself say it. Vivian set another circle of dough in the pan. She didn't look up. "People change when the circumstances change," she said. "That's all." "Maybe," Danny said. Then, after a moment, "The food's better. That's not nothing." "It's definitely something," she agreed, and she let that be the end of it, because she didn't want to examine it any more closely than that herself. Yeah, the change in Wyatt was not a transformation. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own understanding of it. He did not wake up one morning warm and communicative and easy to be around. He remained, fundamentally, a man who had learned to live in a very small emotional space and who did not expand that space easily or quickly. But there were differences, small ones, cumulative ones. He began coming to the kitchen in the evenings occasionally. Not every evening, not even most evenings, but sometimes, and without a clear stated reason. He would appear in the doorway and either find her there or not. And if she was there, he would lean against the doorframe and sometimes say something and sometimes say nothing, and she learned not to treat his silence as a problem requiring a solution. One evening, in late February, he came in, and she was sitting at the work table with a cup of tea, going through a cookbook she'd found in the back of the pantry. An old one, its spine cracked and pages spotted, that had probably belonged to some earlier cook whose name she didn't know. He looked at the book. "Where did you find that?" he said. "Back shelf in the pantry, behind the canning jars," she said. "There's a recipe in here for vinegar pie that I'm curious about." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ellie used to make that." She looked up. He was looking at the book, but his expression was not grief exactly, but something that was the near neighbor of it. Not sharp, just present. "She made it in fall, usually," he said, "when the other fruits were done." Vivian looked at the recipe in the book. The handwriting in the margin, she noticed now, was a woman's careful cursive. Notes about the consistency of the filling, how long to bake it at different altitudes. "Is this her book?" she asked carefully. He looked at the margin notes. Something moved in his face and then went still again. "I don't know how it got in there," he said. He said it flatly, not as an invitation for further conversation. She closed the book gently. "I'll put it somewhere safe," she said. He nodded once. He left. She sat at the work table with the closed book in front of her and felt the particular weight of a moment she hadn't intended to step into. Not guilt exactly, but an awareness that the space she occupied in this house was one that had been someone else's, completely, and that the traces of that person were everywhere if you knew to look for them. She put the book onto the high shelf in her room that night, not back in the pantry. She didn't take recipes from it again. But she kept it because throwing it away seemed wrong, and returning it to the pantry seemed like it would get lost again. March came in with wind and the smell of rain, and the cattle were moved to the spring pastures, and the ranch shifted into a different gear. The gear of a place anticipating the season's real work rather than enduring the season's idleness. More hands arrived, 2 additional cowboys hired for the spring work, and the bunkhouse filled back up, and the quantities she was cooking increased accordingly. She managed it. She managed it the way she'd been managing everything, by waking before 4, by organizing the prep work the evening before, by pushing Alma toward skills Alma was ready to learn even when Alma wasn't certain she was ready, by learning the specific requirements and preferences of every man she cooked for and cataloging them in her head so she didn't waste what she had. She was tired a great deal of the time. She did not say so. It was the kind of tiredness that came from productive work rather than from futility, which made it bearable in a way that the tired months after Daniel died had not been bearable at all. That tired had been the kind that didn't improve with sleep. This tired went away by morning, mostly, and she woke up ready to begin. It was in the 3rd week of March, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the thing happened that changed everything. She heard the shouting from the kitchen, raised voices from the direction of the corral, which wasn't completely unusual. The corral was where men and horses negotiated their relationship, and the negotiation was not always quiet. But this was different. There was a specific quality to emergency shouting that she had learned to identify over 43 years of living among people, a pitch, an urgency that was different from argument or frustration. She set down what she was holding and went to the door. 2 men were running from the corral toward the bunkhouse, and a third, she couldn't tell who from this distance, was down, on the ground, not moving. She did not think about it. She crossed the yard at a pace that was almost running, pushing her skirt out of the way, and reached the corral fence in time to see what had happened. A young cowboy named Caleb, he was perhaps 19, new to the ranch this spring, and she'd learned he was from south of San Antonio, was on the ground near the fence post. A horse was being pulled away from the area by Hatch, who was talking to the animal in a low voice and had the hard expression of a man who needed to focus entirely on the horse in front of him, and was doing so with effort. The horse had apparently spooked badly, and Caleb had been between the animal and the fence. A man named Reed was kneeling beside Caleb trying to get the boy to respond. Another hand was running for the main house. 2 others stood nearby looking like they wanted to help and didn't know what to do with their hands. Caleb was conscious, but barely. His right leg was at an angle it shouldn't have been at. "Step back," Vivian said, coming through the fence gate. Reed looked up at her with an expression that was half relief and half uncertainty. "Step back," she said again, firmly, and he did. She knelt beside the boy. His face was the color of old chalk. She could see him fighting to stay present against whatever pain signal his body was generating. He was biting the inside of his cheek. "Caleb," she said, "look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were glassy, but he was there. "You're going to be all right," she said, because she needed him calm, and that was the thing that would make him calm, and she would deal with whether or not it was entirely true separately. "Don't try to move. Don't try to sit up." "My leg," he said. His voice was about 16 years old. "I know, don't look at it." She had not done this before, not exactly, not this specific thing, but she had spent 3 years nursing Daniel through the lung illness that had eventually killed him. And in that time she had, out of necessity, learned things about bodies in distress that she had never expected to need to know. She had learned to read the difference between pain that meant structural damage and pain that meant something worse. She had learned to keep a person from going into shock by keeping them warm and still and talking to them. She had learned that the most important thing in the first minutes was not the injury itself, but what the injured person did with the fear. "He needs to be carried to somewhere warm," she said to Reed, who was still nearby. "Very carefully, 4 men, lift together, on my count, straight across to the bunkhouse. Can you organize that?" Reed was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Get something to use as a splint first. A straight board, about this long, and strips of cloth. Alma's in the kitchen. She can give you cloth from the linen shelf." He moved. She turned back to Caleb, who was shaking now, fine tremors running through him. "Cold," he said. "I know. We're going to get you inside in just a minute." She had taken her jacket off without thinking about it and laid it over him. "Can you feel your foot?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "Good." She didn't say it out loud, but she felt something settle in her. That mattered considerably. Hatch had gotten the horse secured. He came and crouched beside her. "Doctor's in Red Hollow," he said quietly, so Caleb wouldn't focus on it. 9 miles. "Send someone now," she said. "Fast as they can." "Already sent." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between the two of them was the understanding that the doctor wouldn't be here for at least 2 hours, and that those 2 hours mattered. "You done this before," Hatch said. Not a question. "Not exactly," she said. "Close enough?" She looked at Caleb, who was still looking at her with the glassy, determined eyes of someone who had decided that looking at her was the thing keeping him from doing something worse. "Close enough," she said. Bless him. The next 2 hours were the longest she'd spent in a long time. She worked with what she had, the splint Reed had brought, the cloth, the knowledge in her hands that came from years of caring for someone and learning by necessity how to be competent in the absence of a better option. She kept Caleb talking, kept him warm, monitored his color and his breathing and his responses with the steady, focused attention of someone who understood that panic was a luxury she could not afford right now. The bunkhouse had never been so quiet. Men came and went at the doorway, looking in, and then moving back out to give space. Nobody needed to be told to be quiet. The room understood what the room was. Wyatt came in at some point during those 2 hours. She registered his arrival at the doorway without looking up, recognizing his particular way of entering a space. He did not come all the way in. He stood at the door and took in the room. Caleb on the bunk, Vivian beside him, Hatch standing at the window. And he did not say anything. He just stood there. She felt his presence at the edge of the room, and it was not a problem, and she did not address it. He was still standing there when the doctor arrived. Dr. Alcott was 60, brisk, and had clearly been in a hurry from the moment someone had pounded on his door in Red Hollow. He came through the bunkhouse door with his bag already open and went straight to the bunk, and Vivian moved back and let him work. He examined the leg. He looked at the splint she'd applied. He looked at Caleb's color and felt his pulse and asked Caleb several direct questions. Then he looked at Vivian. "Who set this splint?" he said. "I did," she said. "You're not a nurse." "No." He looked at the splint again. "It's correct," he said. "It's actually quite correct." He looked at her with the specific expression of a man reassessing a situation. "The leg is broken, but it's a clean break and the bones haven't shifted. He'll need setting and rest, but with a clean break like this, properly immobilized." He looked at the splint again. "He'll recover full use." The bunkhouse, which had been very quiet, made a sound. It was a collective exhale, dozens of men who had been holding a collective breath for 2 hours, and it moved through the room like the first gust before a rain. Vivian stepped back from the bunk. She was aware, now that she was no longer needed, that her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them together and held them still. Hatch was beside her. He said low, "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "Yes." She walked out of the bunkhouse into the March afternoon and stood in the yard and breathed the cool air for a minute. Just breathed it, while behind her the doctor worked, and the men talked, and the ranch made the sounds of a place where a crisis had been and was now receding. She became aware, at some point, that Wyatt Blackwood was standing a few feet away. He was looking at her, not in a way that asked anything of her or required anything from her, just looking. "He'll be all right," she said. "I know," Wyatt said. "Alcott just told me." She looked at the distant tree line. The afternoon light was starting to go golden and long. "You knew what to do," Wyatt said. "I knew enough," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet. Then, "Mrs. Hale." She looked at him. He seemed to be looking for the right sentence, which was unusual enough. He was not a man who searched for sentences typically, that she waited. "This ranch owes you something," he said. "I cook the meals," she said. "That's what I was hired for." He shook his head, slightly, just slightly. "No," he said. "It's not." He went back toward the main house. She watched him go and then looked back at the tree line and the long golden light, and she stood there a moment longer than she needed to before she went back to the kitchen to start supper. Because whatever he had meant by that, whatever it was he'd seen in these 3 months, whatever slow reckoning was happening somewhere behind those careful eyes, dinner still needed to be made. The men would be hungry. That was real, and it was hers, and she'd learned to trust what was real. She went in, and she started cooking. Caleb recovered slowly, the way broken things generally did, not on any particular schedule and not without setbacks. The first week he was largely confined to the bunk, and Vivian sent meals across to him twice a day, portioned differently than the rest of the bunkhouse food. Softer things, broth-based things, food that didn't require much effort on his part because effort was going elsewhere in his body. Dr. Alcott came out from Red Hollow on the 4th day to check the set and reported that everything was holding correctly. And when he left, he stopped by the kitchen and told Vivian that the immobilization she'd applied in those first 2 hours had very likely prevented a significantly more complicated recovery. "You kept him still, and you kept him warm, and you kept him calm," Alcott said. "In my experience, those 3 things account for more than most people realize." "I just did what seemed necessary," she said. "That's what medicine usually is," he said, and left. She thought about that for a while after he'd gone. She thought about how much of what she'd learned in her life had come from necessity rather than intention, from being in a situation where not knowing wasn't an option, and so she'd figured it out. She thought about Daniel's last year and how she'd learned to read his breathing and to know when the bad hours were coming and to have the room arranged in a certain way before he needed it arranged that way, and how none of that knowledge had come from anywhere except from being there and having no alternative but to pay attention. Necessity was a hard teacher. It was also thorough. By the 2nd week, Caleb was sitting up and eating with the other men, his legs splinted and elevated on a grain sack, and by the 3rd week he was moving carefully around the bunkhouse on a crutch that one of the older hands had carved for him from a fork of ash wood. He was going to be out of full commission for another 6 to 8 weeks, the doctor had said, but he'd recover completely if he didn't do anything foolish before the bone finished mending. He was 19 years old and from south of San Antonio, and he had nowhere else to go if Wyatt decided he wasn't worth keeping on while he healed. She knew this because he'd told her, in a circuitous way that involved mentioning his family situation and his finances, and eventually arriving at the underlying anxiety without quite naming it directly. She went to Greer about it. Greer looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man who was being asked to do something that wasn't strictly his call. "That's Wyatt's decision," he said. "I know it is, but you have influence on that decision, and I'd like you to use it." Greer looked at her for a moment longer. "You could ask him yourself," he said. "You've been talking to him more than I have lately." She hadn't quite thought about it that way, but she supposed it was true. "I'm the cook," she said. "My opinion on staffing decisions carries a specific weight, which is to say, not very much." "Your opinion on most things," Greer said carefully, "carries more weight around here than you seem to realize." She took that in without responding to it directly. The boy didn't cause the accident, she said. The latch on the south gate caused the accident. I know. Letting him go because he was injured in an accident that wasn't his fault would be, she chose the word, wrong. Greer looked at her steadily. Then he nodded once. I'll talk to Wyatt. Caleb was not let go. She heard nothing official about the decision. Nobody came to tell her, because nobody thought it was her business, which was fair enough. But 2 days after her conversation with Greer, she saw Caleb sitting outside the bunkhouse in the late afternoon sun, working a piece of leather with his hands, some piece of harness that needed repair, doing the seated work that needed doing while he couldn't do the standing kind. The fact of him being there, occupied, was the answer. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. April arrived, and with it the real beginning of the ranch's working year, the season that everything else had been building toward. More cattle to move, more range to cover. The work expanded and the days got longer, and the bunkhouse population swelled again as additional seasonal hands came on, and Vivian's kitchen ran from before 4 in the morning until well into the evening without pause. She was tired in a different way than she'd been tired in the winter. A more sustained, grinding tiredness, the kind that came from not having any real off hours. But she had Alma working harder now, more confident, taking on portions of the work she hadn't been able to handle in November. And she had, without quite planning it, established a rhythm in the kitchen that made the volume manageable even if it was never easy. What she noticed in April, between the exhaustion and the constant motion, was that the ranch had become a different place than the one she'd arrived at in October. Not transformed. That was too large a word, too neat and complete. But changed. The bunkhouse was louder at night in the way bunkhouses were supposed to be loud, with argument and card games and the occasional song from someone who fancied himself a singer. Men who had worked in near silence through the winter had rediscovered the habit of conversation. There was, she observed, a different quality of attention in the yard. Men who noticed each other, who helped without being asked, who made the small gestures that added up to something being a community rather than just a collection of workers occupying the same property. She couldn't take credit for all of it. Spring itself was part of it. Warmth and longer days and the feeling of forward motion after months of cold endurance had their own effect on the spirit. But she thought about what Hatch had said in the winter, about comfort not happening by accident, and she allowed herself privately that she had contributed something. The man she couldn't quite read, through all of this, was Wyatt. He was working harder than any of his men, which was apparently his way during the driving season. Out early, back late, moving from one part of the property to another with the systematic thoroughness of someone who needed to know that everything was accounted for. She saw him mostly at breakfast, less often at dinner, and sometimes not at supper at all, if the day had taken him far enough that he ate on the range. She had established the habit of leaving something covered on the back of the range for those evenings, something that could sit for hours without suffering, so that when he came in late there was food without requiring her to still be there. She knew he noticed because one morning he came in and said, without preamble, "You don't need to wait up." "I don't wait up," she said accurately. "I leave something warming and go to bed." He seemed to absorb this. "It's unnecessary." "A man who's been working since before sunrise needs to eat when he comes in," she said. "Leaving a pot on the range is not a significant sacrifice on my part." He looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she'd come to recognize. Not quite surprise, more like the recalibration of an expectation. Then he sat down and had his breakfast. He didn't bring it up again. The pot kept appearing on the back of the range on the evenings he was out late. They had arrived at a wordless agreement about it, the kind that was more durable than any spoken one. It was Greer who first mentioned the bank situation had gotten more serious. He came to the kitchen in the second week of April on a morning when Vivian was alone. Alma had gone to the root cellar. And he sat down at the work table, and she poured him coffee without being asked because he'd been coming to her kitchen long enough that it was automatic now. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the table. She waited because she'd learned to read Greer's silences well enough to know when one needed to be waited out. "The bank sent a man out last week," he said. She sat down across from him. "I didn't know that. Wyatt didn't want it announced." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "It's not good, Vivian." He'd started using her first name somewhere in the previous month without either of them marking the transition. The accounting error was the start of it, but what the auditing uncovered goes further. There are outstanding loans that weren't being managed correctly. There are payments owed to the ranch from cattle sales 2 and 3 years back that were never followed up on. Buyers who essentially kept the money because nobody came asking for it. She was quiet, taking this in. "How much, total?" she asked. "More than Wyatt has liquid," Greer said. "The land and the cattle are worth many times over what's owed, but a bank doesn't see land and cattle the way it sees cash, and the terms of the existing loans—" He stopped, shook his head. "There are deadlines, real ones." "Is he going to lose the ranch?" Greer looked at her directly. "He might," he said. "If things don't get corrected and corrected fast, there's a real chance. Not certain, but real." She sat with that. Outside the window, the spring morning was bright and busy. Men moving across the yard, the distant sound of cattle, the unhurried activity of a working ranch going about its business without knowing that the ground under it was less stable than it looked. She thought about what it would mean to these men. Hatch, who'd been here 11 years, Danny, who had nowhere else to go, Caleb on his crutch, the 30 other hands who'd built their working lives around this particular piece of Texas land. She thought about Wyatt. "Does he know you're telling me?" she said. "No," Greer said. "Why are you telling me?" He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Because you notice things," he said, "and because I think—" He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I think he's going to try to solve this alone, the way he does everything, and I think alone is not the right approach here." She understood what he was asking without him saying it, which was characteristic of Greer. He communicated the shape of a thing and let you fill in the contents. "What's the timeline?" she said. "The bank wants answers by the end of May. That's 6 weeks. She nodded slowly. 6 weeks. "There are debts owed to this ranch," she said. "You said buyers who kept the money because nobody asked." "Yes." "Do you have records of those transactions?" "Somewhere. The records are not well organized." He said this with the careful understatement of someone describing chaos without wanting to call it chaos. "The previous bookkeeper's system, if you can call it that, is going to take time to work through." "Then someone needs to start working through it," she said. He looked at her across the table with a very specific expression. Not surprised, not quite. More like the expression of a man watching a thing he'd half expected happen. "Yes," he said. "They do." She didn't go to Wyatt directly. She went to the books. Greer gave her access to the office and the ledgers after one conversation with Wyatt that she wasn't present for and whose details she didn't ask about. All she knew was that the morning after she'd talked to Greer, she came to the office at noon. Between the morning feeding and the preparation for supper, the only real gap she had in her day, and the office door was unlocked and a stack of ledgers and loose papers was on the desk. She sat down and started at the beginning. What she found was not quite the chaos she'd expected. It was more organized than chaos and less organized than a working system. The residue of someone who had known what they were doing at some point but had either stopped caring or stopped trying, or both. There were records, but they were incomplete. There were notes and margins that referred to other documents that weren't present. There were columns of figures that made sense individually and didn't reconcile with anything else. She worked methodically because that was the only way to work with something like this. She started with what she could verify. The bank statements Greer had produced, the cattle sale records from the past 3 years, the expense records that were more or less intact. She cross-referenced what she could. She made her own notes, her own columns, her own running totals on fresh paper she'd found in the drawer. It took her 3 sessions of 2 hours each before she started to see the shape of it clearly. There were 11 outstanding payments owed to Iron Ridge Ranch from cattle sales between 18 months and 3 years prior. The total came to $4,200 and some change. She couldn't be precise because 2 of the records were incomplete, but the number was in that range. These were real debts, real obligations that had been incurred by real buyers who had received cattle and not paid in full. In 2 cases, partial payments had been made and then stopped. In 9 cases, as far as she could tell, there had been no follow-up at all. $4,200, roughly, sitting uncollected. The total shortfall the bank was concerned about was somewhere around $5,500. She set her pencil down and looked at the numbers on her paper for a long time. Then she picked up the pencil and kept working. She told Wyatt that evening. He was in the study when she knocked. She could see the light under the door. And when she knocked, he said, "Come in," without the usual pause that suggested he'd expected to be alone and was adjusting to company. He was sitting behind the desk with papers spread in front of him and a lamp turned high. And he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who had been deep in his own problem and was now registering that someone else was also in the room. She came in and stood in front of the desk and put her notes on it. She put them directly in front of him so he could see the numbers and the names. 11 outstanding payments, she said. I cross-referenced what I could against the sale records and the bank statements. The total is somewhere around $4,200, possibly more if the two incomplete records resolve higher. He looked at the paper. His face was very still. You've been going through the ledgers, he said. Greer gave me access, she said. I told him I wanted to look. He was quiet for a moment. When? Over the past 3 days. 2 hours midday. It's the gap I have. He kept looking at the paper. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move down the column of names and figures, and she could see him working it against what he already knew, doing the same arithmetic she'd done and arriving at the same place. If these are recoverable, he said slowly, the gap to the bank closes to around $1,300. Yes, she said, which is manageable. If they're recoverable, he repeated. His tone wasn't pessimistic, just precise. Some of them won't be, she said, because she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. 2 of these buyers, she pointed to 2 names on the list. I couldn't find any permanent addresses in the records. They may be hard to locate, but the other 9 have addresses or at least towns of record. And of those, 3 are large operations that did enough business with this ranch that they have ongoing reason to maintain a good relationship. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. You did this, he said. Not an accusation, not quite a question either. Someone needed to, she said. He looked up from the paper at last. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the yard after Caleb's accident. Not with any of his usual containment, but directly, openly, in a way that was almost uncomfortable because it was so different from his habitual self. Mrs. Hale, he said. I know it's not my place, she said, before he could say whatever he was going to say. I know I'm the cook, and this is not remotely in the description of what I was hired to do. I understand if you'd rather I stay in my lane. She held his gaze. But I'm also a grown woman who can read a ledger, and I was standing right here, and the problem was solvable. So I tried to solve it. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them threw his face into sharp light and shadow, and she was aware, as she occasionally was these days, of the specific quality of his attention, the way he listened, when he listened, which was with a completeness that most people didn't bring to the act. I'm not going to tell you to stay in your lane, he said. She waited. I'm going to ask, he said, if you're willing to keep working on this. Properly. Not just the ledgers, the letters. Correspondence to these buyers. Greer can help. But I need someone who can write clearly and think clearly, and who won't flinch when the answer is uncomfortable. She was quiet for a moment. That would take more than 2 hours at midday, she said. I know. Alma would need to take on more of the daily cooking. I'll pay her accordingly. I'll pay you additionally for the time. He said it matter-of-factly, like a business arrangement, which she understood was his way of making it manageable, keeping it in the realm of the practical so it didn't have to be named as something else. All right, she said. He nodded once. He looked back at her notes. These 3, he said, pointing to the 3 largest operations she'd flagged. I know 2 of the principals personally. I'll write out to see them directly rather than writing. He looked up. Face-to-face is better for this kind of thing. Yes, she said. It usually is. He nodded again. She took that as her dismissal and picked up her notes and went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the counter for a moment in the lamplight of her own space and thought about what had just happened. She'd walked into that study with numbers and come out with... She searched for the right word and settled on authority. The authority to do a thing that needed doing on behalf of a place she had somehow, in 6 months, come to feel partially responsible for. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure when it had started. She wasn't sure she wanted to examine it too closely. She went to bed instead because morning came early and the work was what the work was. The weeks that followed were the most complicated she'd spent since arriving at Iron Ridge. Not complicated in ways she couldn't manage, but she was working 2 jobs now, effectively, the kitchen and the office, and doing both well required a kind of sustained division of attention that she had to consciously maintain. She reorganized her kitchen schedule so that the most intensive cooking happened in the early morning and the evening, with Alma covering the midday preparations, and she spent her noon hours in the office working through correspondence. She wrote letters, 11 of them, drafted carefully, revised twice each, formal but not stiff, clear about the debt owed without being threatening, firm about the need for resolution without being the kind of language that put a man on the defensive before he'd read the third paragraph. She'd written enough difficult letters in her life. To creditors, after Daniel died, to his business partners, to the bank in Joplin, to know the difference between a letter that made someone feel accused and a letter that made someone feel they had an opportunity to do the right thing. The distinction mattered. People responded better to the second kind. Wyatt rode out to see the 3 largest debtors himself, as he'd said he would. He was gone 3 days on the first trip and 4 days on the second. And while he was gone, the ranch ran in the way a well-run operation ran when the boss was absent. Not perfectly, because nothing ran perfectly, but capably, with Greer holding the operational threads and the men doing their work. She managed the house in his absence without being asked to. She noticed things that needed attention, made sure they were attended to, kept the practical machinery of the place moving. Greer noticed. He didn't say much about it, which was his way of saying something. When Wyatt came back from the first trip, he came directly to the kitchen before he'd even cleaned up from the road, and she saw immediately from his face that something had gone right. He wasn't a man whose face showed relief in any obvious way, but there was a looseness in his jaw and a directness in his eyes that wasn't his usual careful containment. Harper agreed to settle, he said. Full amount minus 30 days. He didn't fight it. Harper was the largest of the 3, over $1,200. That's good news, she said. He apologized, Wyatt said, and something in his voice said he'd been surprised by that. Said the oversight was on his end. He knew the balance was there. He'd just not been pressed. People often don't do what's right if they're not asked, she said. That's not a moral failing. It's just how people work. He looked at her with a slight narrowing of his eyes, as if she'd said something he was going to have to think about later. The second one's more complicated, he said. Dalton. He's in financial difficulty himself. He can settle partial, maybe 60 cents on the dollar, but not the full amount. 60 cents on the dollar is better than nothing, she said. If you press him for the full amount, you might get nothing at all. That's what I told him, Wyatt said. We agreed on 65. She nodded. She poured him coffee without asking and set it in front of him, and he sat down at her work table in Hatch's spot, which he'd started using sometime in the past month, and drank it. The third one, he said, after a moment. Brennan. I haven't gotten to him yet. He's further south, and his foreman told me he's been out of the area. I know, she said. I got a reply to my letter from his wife last week. She said he'd be back by the 15th. He looked at her. You already wrote to him. I wrote to all 11, she said, a week ago. I told you I was doing the correspondence. A pause. I thought you meant as a supplement, in case I couldn't reach them directly. I wrote to all of them, she said again, not apologetically. A letter and a personal visit from the ranch owner are not the same thing, but they reinforce each other. If Brennan got a formal letter and then you show up, he knows it's serious. Wyatt looked at her with that expression again, the recalibration one. You're not easy to stay ahead of, he said. It was, she realized, a compliment. I'm not trying to stay ahead of you, she said. I'm trying to fix the problem. Yes, he said. I know you are. Awesome. 3 of the 11 letters came back with responses within the first 2 weeks. 2 of them were from smaller operations, under $100 each, and both agreed to settle, one immediately and one on a 30-day payment. The third response was from one of the men whose address she hadn't been certain about, a rancher named Cull, who had apparently moved operations 2 counties east, but whose forwarding information had made it to him through a series of intermediaries. His letter was terse, but agreed to pay what was owed. The ledger math was improving. Slowly, imperfectly, with each piece of correspondence and each of Wyatt's direct negotiations, adding another layer to a picture that was becoming incrementally clearer and incrementally more solvable. But the bank's deadline was the end of May, and by the first week of May, they were still approximately $2,000 short of what they needed, with 4 letters still unanswered and one more trip for Wyatt still to make. Vivian sat in the office on a Tuesday afternoon with the numbers in front of her and the window open to the warm May air, and she thought about what the remaining margin looked like. It was not hopeless. She'd been in positions that were hopeless, real ones, positions where there was no arithmetic that worked, and this was not that. But it was tight. Tight enough that one thing going wrong in the remaining 5 weeks would change the calculation significantly. She thought about Greer's phrase from April. Wyatt would try to solve this alone. The thing was, he wasn't entirely alone anymore. But she wasn't sure he fully understood that yet. She wasn't sure she fully understood what she meant by it herself. She put the numbers away and went back to the kitchen because supper needed making and the numbers would still be there tomorrow. It was Hatch who told her, over coffee on a Thursday morning in the second week of May, about what people in Red Hollow were saying. He came in early, before the rest of the kitchen was fully running, and he sat at the work table with the look of someone who had decided that a thing needed saying and was working out the best way to say it. "There's talk in town," he said. She looked at him. "What kind of talk?" "The financial kind." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "Word's gotten out that Iron Ridge has bank trouble. I don't know how—" Somebody at the bank, somebody in town who saw Wyatt's meetings, somebody who talks too much, doesn't matter. The talk is out there. What are they saying? That the ranch is in trouble. Some people are saying Wyatt's going to have to sell off sections of land. Some people are saying the whole operation might fold. He looked at his coffee. "You know how talk is. It starts with something real, and by the time it's gone through 3 people, it's twice as bad as the original." She was quiet for a moment. "Does Wyatt know?" Greer told him yesterday. He took it the way he takes most things. Hatch paused. "But here's the other part. There's a man in Red Hollow, a buyer, a land speculator type, who's been making quiet inquiries. About Iron Ridge specifically. Whether sections might come available. Whether the whole property might be sold under pressure." She felt something harden in her chest. "Who?" "Name's Fallow," Hatch said. "Came to the area about a year ago. Been buying up smaller parcels north of here. A couple operations that went under in the dry summer. He's—" Hatch stopped, chose his words carefully. "He's the kind of man who shows up when other people have problems." She knew that kind of man. She'd met several in the months after Daniel died. Men who knocked on the door with sympathetic faces and offers to help, and whose help consisted primarily of acquiring her assets at a fraction of their value. She had a specific and unglamorous feeling about that kind of man. "Does he have the resources to actually buy?" she asked. "That's the part nobody knows. He talks like he does, but talk is cheap." "Everything's cheap until it isn't," she said. Hatch nodded. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. "I thought you should know," he said, "because you seem to be the one keeping track of things." She didn't respond to that, but after he left, she stood at the counter for a long time thinking about a man named Fallow, who showed up when other people had problems, and about the 5 weeks left before the bank's deadline, and about 4,000 acres of Texas land that 30 men had built their working lives on top of. She thought about all of this carefully, the way she thought about a hard recipe. Not with panic, but with the methodical attention of someone who understood that most problems, if you broke them into their components and addressed each component in the right order, were more solvable than they first appeared. She was going to need to talk to Wyatt about Fallow. She was also going to need to look more carefully at the outstanding accounts. There had to be something she'd missed. There almost always was. She poured herself a second cup of coffee. She rarely had a second cup, and sat down at the work table with her notes and started going through them again. Outside, the May morning was clear and warming fast. The sky, the particular pale blue of a Texas spring that looked fragile and wasn't. Across the yard, she could hear the sounds of the ranch at work. Horses, men, cattle, somewhere in the distance. The sounds of an operation that didn't yet know how close to the edge it was running. She bent over her notes and kept going. She told Wyatt about Fallow that same evening. She waited until after supper, when the main house had gone quiet and the yard outside had settled into the particular stillness of a working ranch at the end of a long day. She knocked on the study door and he said, "Come in," and she came in and stood in front of his desk the way she had in April with her ledger notes, except this time she didn't have papers to put down. This time it was just the information, delivered plain. She told him what Hatch had said. The talk in Red Hollow. The speculator named Fallow. The quiet inquiries about Iron Ridge land. Wyatt listened without interrupting. His face did not change in any dramatic way while she spoke, but she had learned to read the smaller signals. The slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his hands on the desk went from relaxed to very still. He was absorbing it, and he was not happy about what he was absorbing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Fallow," he said. "You know him?" "I know of him." He looked at the desk. "He bought the Alderman place last fall. 1,800 acres, went for about a third of what it was worth because the Aldermans had no leverage. The family had been on that land for 20 years. He said it with a flatness that contained underneath it something that was not flat at all. "Hatch said he doesn't know if Fallow actually has the resources to buy," Vivian said. "He has backing," Wyatt said. "There's a consortium out of Houston. They've been buying distressed ranch land across 3 counties. Fallow is their agent, essentially. Finds the properties, makes the approach, fronts the transaction." He paused. "He's been watching this place for a while. I've heard his name before in other contexts." She stood across the desk from him. "Then he already knows about the bank situation." "Probably. Which means the talk in Red Hollow might not be accidental." Wyatt looked up at her. Something shifted in his expression. "No," he said slowly. "It might not be." She'd thought about this in the kitchen after Hatch left. The specific timing of the talk, how it had spread at exactly the moment when Iron Ridge was most vulnerable, when the ledger problems were being worked through and the outcome was still uncertain. Talk like that, spreading at a moment like that, could be organic. Or it could be helped along by someone who benefited from making a troubled operation look more troubled than it was. "If buyers think the ranch is close to folding," she said, "they won't make competitive offers. They'll wait for the distress price." "Yes," he said. "So the most useful thing Fallow could do, if he wants this land cheaply, is make sure everyone believes you're going under." Wyatt looked at her steadily. "You've thought about this?" "I've had a few hours," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The bank meeting is in 3 weeks, the 3rd of June. He said it like he was saying it to himself as much as to her. "If I go into that meeting with the full recovery documented, the outstanding payments, the corrected accounts, the bank has no grounds to force a sale. Fallow has nothing." "Can you get to the full recovery in 3 weeks?" He picked up her notes from the edge of the desk. She'd left copies there from the previous session, and looked at the 4 outstanding accounts, the ones that hadn't responded yet, the ones she'd been worrying about in her second cup of coffee this morning. "2 of these I can reach directly," he said. "I'll leave tomorrow for the first. Greer can handle the operation while I'm out." He looked up. "The other 2, I'll write again," she said. "A second letter, more direct than the first. And I want to look at something in the original sale records. I think there may be a 5th account I didn't find the first time. There was a reference in the margin of one of the quarterly pages to a payment arrangement I haven't been able to match to any named buyer." He looked at her. "You found that?" "I'm not certain what it is yet. I need another hour in the records." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them was turned lower than usual tonight, and the light in the room was warm and close, and she was aware, not for the first time, of the smallness of the space they shared in these conversations. The desk between them, the papers, the practical urgency of a problem that had made proximity necessary. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Whatever you find, whatever we recover, I want you to know that this ranch is going to survive it." He said it without theatrics, just a statement of fact, the way he stated everything. "I'm not going to let Fallow or anyone else have this land. These men have built their lives here. I owe them a place to keep working." She thought about what Greer had told her months ago, that Wyatt had stopped being particular, had stopped caring about the outcome. She thought about the man sitting across from her now, who was very specifically caring about the outcome, who had ridden across 3 counties to collect debts and sat up nights with ledgers, and was going to ride out again tomorrow before the sun came up. "I know," she said. She meant it. "Don't." He left before dawn the next morning. She heard the horse in the yard at 4:15, the sound of it moving out through the gate while she was still building the fire in the range, and she stood at the window for a moment watching the darkness where he'd disappeared and then went back to her work. The ranch without him was quieter in a specific way, not emptier exactly, but different in the way a room was different when the person whose room it was happened to be somewhere else. Greer held things together with his customary efficiency. The men worked their full days. Caleb, now off his crutch and moving carefully on a mending leg, had been put on light fence duty and was performing it with the focused determination of someone who needed to prove something. Vivian divided her time between the kitchen and the office, the way she had been for the past 3 weeks, except now there was an added pressure in it that hadn't been there before. The 3rd of June was a specific deadline. She could feel it in the way she felt Emil's timing, the awareness of each thing that needed to happen and how long each thing took and where the margin was for error. She found the 5th account. It was buried in a discrepancy she'd noticed in the margin notation, a reference to a payment arrangement with the initials CW, which didn't match any buyer in the main ledger. She spent an afternoon working backward through 3 years of loose papers until she found a separate handwritten agreement, not in the main ledger at all, folded inside the cover of a different record book entirely, for a cattle purchase made by a man named Caldwell Ray, a rancher from the eastern part of the county, for $740, of which $200 had been paid up front, and the remainder was to be delivered in 2 installments that, as far as she could tell, had never arrived. $540 sitting in a folded piece of paper inside the wrong ledger for 2 years. She sat back in the office chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was something she didn't often do in the middle of a workday. Then she looked at the paper in her hand and added $540 to the figure she'd been carrying in her head. The number that resulted was almost exactly what they needed. Not quite, but almost. She wrote to Ray that afternoon. She didn't wait. She wrote the letter, made a copy in her notes, sealed it, and had Danny write it into Red Hollow to the post office before supper. Then she went and made supper and tried not to count days. Well, Wyatt came back on the 4th day. He came back later than she'd expected, close to dark, and she had kept supper warm the way she'd been keeping things warm for him all spring, covered pot on the back of the range, the habit so established now that she did it without thinking about it on any evening he was out late. She heard the horse in the yard at about 8 o'clock and heard him at the pump outside, and then the back door of the main house, and then a pause that she read as him seeing the light under the kitchen door and adjusting his direction. He came into the kitchen looking road-worn, dusty in a way that 4 days on a Texas road in late May created, tired in the specific physical way of someone who had been on horseback too long and sleeping in rough conditions and pushing hard. He sat down at the work table without ceremony, and she set the covered pot in front of him and poured coffee and sat across from him while he ate, because she had things to tell him and she wasn't going to wait for a formal setting. "Brennan settled," he said, between the first and second mouthful. "Full amount. He'd been trying to contact us, apparently, sent 2 letters to an address that must have been old. He was relieved to have someone show up." A pause while he ate. "The other one, Cutter, he's gone. His wife said he left the area 8 months ago and she doesn't know where. That money may not be recoverable." She nodded. She'd been prepared for that possibility. "I found a 5th account," she said. "Caldwell Ray. $540 outstanding. I wrote to him yesterday." He looked up from the bowl. She told him about the folded agreement in the wrong ledger, the initials in the margin, the afternoon of working backward through 3 years of paper. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "If Ray pays," he said. "We're within $200 of what the bank needs," she said, "which is manageable." He looked at her across the table. He looked, not relieved, not exactly, more like a man who had been bracing for impact and had been slightly released from the brace. A subtle thing, but real. "It's not settled yet," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's close." He ate the rest of the meal without speaking, which was not unusual, and she stayed at the table because she hadn't finished saying what she had to say. When he pushed the empty bowl aside and wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, she said, "There's something else, about Fallow." He looked at her. "Hatch told me today that Fallow was in Red Hollow again. He had a meeting with a man from the Houston office, the consortium that backs him. The timing isn't accidental. He's watching the bank deadline." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Of course he is." "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I'd like an honest answer." He waited. "Is there any part of the ranch's situation that gives him a legitimate claim? Any document, any arrangement, anything that a buyer could point to and say he had prior right or prior agreement?" Wyatt looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "There is nothing like that." Then if you go into the June 3rd meeting with the accounts recovered and the books corrected, he has no ground to stand on. That's correct. Then that's the work, she said. It was not complicated as a conclusion. The work was the work, and they both knew what it was, and neither of them was the kind of person who made things more complicated by discussing them at length. She'd learned that about him, and she suspected he'd learned something similar about her. She stood up and cleared the bowl from the table. "Thank you," he said, "for supper." She paused. He almost never said thank you for the food. She couldn't remember him saying it in a direct, simple way, not in the weeks and months she'd been here. "You're welcome," she said, and went back to the kitchen. What? Ray's reply came on the 28th of May, 5 days before the bank meeting. She was in the office when Greer brought it in from the post run, and she opened it carefully with her letter knife and read it at the desk. Ray was not defensive and not apologetic. He was a plain-spoken man, from the style of the letter, who stated the facts as he saw them. He had made an arrangement. The arrangement had apparently gotten lost in administrative confusion on Iron Ridge's side. He was prepared to settle the full amount of $540 at the bank in Red Hollow on or before the 1st of June. She read the letter twice. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was in the yard talking to Greer about a fence line issue, and she came out of the main house with the letter in her hand and crossed the yard toward them with a directness that made both men look up. She handed Wyatt the letter without preamble. He read it. Greer watched his face. "Ray," Wyatt said. "Full amount," she said, "before June 1st. Greer looked at her. He looked at Wyatt. Something passed between the three of them that didn't need to be spoken. The particular quality of a shared understanding among people who had been working toward the same thing and had just seen it become possible. "I need to get to the bank," Wyatt said. "I know," Vivian said. "The accounts are organized, all of it. I can have the full documentation ready for you by tomorrow morning." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment, that direct, open look that was different from how he'd looked at her 6 months ago, the one that had no container around it. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning." She went back to the office and worked until she couldn't see the pages anymore, and then she lit the lamp and kept going. A sec. The storm came on the 2nd of June, the night before the bank meeting. She had not expected it. The previous 3 days had been clear and warm, the sky that deep southwestern blue that looked permanent, and nobody at the ranch had been paying particular attention to weather signs because nobody had any reason to. They were focused on the bank, on the numbers, on the meeting in the morning. The first sign was the wind shifting, sometime after 9 in the evening, coming around from the southwest and taking on a different quality. Heavier, more insistent, carrying moisture in a way the air hadn't had all week. She noticed it at the kitchen window and stepped out onto the back step and looked at the sky. The western horizon was dark in a way that wasn't nighttime dark. She went straight to Greer. He was at the bunkhouse and he came out and looked at the sky with her, and said a word she wouldn't have said herself and immediately went for the men. What followed was the organized chaos of a ranch preparing for severe weather in the dark. Cattle to move to protected ground, horses to secure, equipment to bring in or tie down. The dozen small tasks that the difference between a storm hitting a prepared operation and an unprepared one. The men moved fast and without much discussion, because they'd done versions of this before, and the body knew what to do even when the mind was still catching up. Vivian was not a cattlewoman, and she knew it, but she knew what her part was. She went to the kitchen and she started making food. Not for right now, for later. For when the men came in cold and wet and exhausted, possibly in the middle of the night, possibly at dawn, whenever it was. She made a big pot of beef stew with everything she had that was hearty. She made bread, 2 batches, because bread was fast warmth. She made coffee and left it on the low heat and made a second pot ready to go. She filled the water barrel in the kitchen from the pump, because in a bad storm, the pump sometimes quit working, and she wanted reserves. Alma appeared at the kitchen door around 10 o'clock, wide-eyed and unsure. "Stay in here," Vivian told her. "Help me with the bread." They worked side by side while outside the wind climbed and the first rain started. Not gentle, not building gradually, but arriving with the suddenness of a storm that had made up its mind. It hit the kitchen roof like gravel, and the window glass shuddered in its frame, and somewhere out in the yard she could hear men's voices over the rain calling to each other. She did not go to the window to watch. She kept working, Around midnight, Greer came in soaked through, dripping on her kitchen floor, and she handed him a towel and a cup of coffee. And he told her without sitting down that the cattle had mostly been moved to the south shelter, that the horses were secure, that 3 men had taken bad falls in the mud, nothing serious, cuts and bruising, and that Wyatt was still out on the range with 6 of the hands checking the far herd. "How bad is the storm?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said, "but not the worst I've seen. The problem is the ground is so dry from the summer that the water is running off fast instead of absorbing. There's flooding in the East Draw." "Is anyone near the East Draw?" "Wyatt knows about it. He'll stay clear." She nodded. She handed him a bowl of stew. He ate it standing in about 3 minutes and went back out. She turned back to the stove. Between midnight and 4 in the morning, the kitchen became a way station. Men coming in from the storm in groups of 2 and 3, soaked and cold, and she fed them and sent them back or told them to rest on the floor if they were done. And they did, some of them actually sleeping on the kitchen floor with their backs against the wall, which would have seemed strange to her once and now seemed like the obvious right use of a warm room. Caleb came in at 1:30 with his mending leg and mud to the knee, and she put him on a stool and kept him there, which he didn't argue with. Danny came in at 3 with a cut on his forehead that was more dramatic looking than serious, and she cleaned it and told him to hold a cloth to it, and he sat at the work table and fell asleep sitting up. She kept the stew going, she kept the coffee going. She moved through her kitchen in the lamplight while the storm hammered the roof overhead and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the steady hum of activity, something that she recognized but couldn't have named exactly. A sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Not heroically, just practically. The work was the work. Wyatt came in at 4:30 in the morning. He came through the back door and she heard him and turned from the stove. He was as wet as the others, but he had the look of a man who had been the last one in, who had stayed on the range until the last possible check was done, who had not come in until everyone and everything that could be accounted for had been accounted for. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, at the men sleeping against the wall, at Danny at the work table, at Caleb on his stool, at the pots on the range, at Alma asleep in the corner chair with a dish towel in her lap. He looked at Vivian. She handed him a towel. She handed him coffee. She handed him a bowl of stew. He sat down in the only empty spot, the corner of the work table across from the sleeping Danny, and he ate without speaking. When he finished, he wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and said, "The far herd is fine. We lost maybe 8 head to the flooding in the draw. They went in before we could turn them. Everything else is accounted for." "I'm sorry about the 8, she said. "It could have been worse." He looked around the kitchen again. "You kept this going all night. It needed to be kept going." He looked at her steadily over the coffee cup. He looked, she thought, like a man who was trying to decide whether to say something. That was unusual. He was not typically a man who visibly wrestled with whether to speak. He generally either spoke or didn't, without apparent negotiation. "What?" she said. "I was going to say..." He stopped, started again. "When I was out there tonight in the middle of it, I knew the ranch was here. I knew..." He stopped again. He was not a man who found words easily for certain kinds of things, and she could see him working at it. "I knew you were here," he said finally, "and it made the work out there easier, knowing that." She was quiet. He looked at the table as if the sentence had cost him something and he needed a moment. "The bank meeting is in 4 hours," he said. "I know." She refilled his coffee. "Your documents are on the desk in the office. Everything organized. The Ray letter is on top." He nodded. He looked at the sleeping men in his kitchen, in the lamplight, the morning still dark outside and the storm finally quieting to a steady, ordinary rain. "They stayed," he said, meaning the men. Meaning through the night and the storm and the years of emotional distance and a ranch that had asked a great deal and given back less warmth than it should have. "They stayed," she agreed. "That's what it means when people decide a place is theirs." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them was everything that had accumulated since October. The ledgers and the letters, the early mornings and the slow conversations, the night of the accident and the months of numbers, and the kitchen that had become the center of something larger than a kitchen. She was 43 years old and she had not expected any of this. She wasn't sure he had either. "Get a few hours of sleep," she said. You need to be sharp at that meeting." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the near neighbor of one, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "You're telling me to go to bed." "Someone has to," she said. He stood up. He looked at her once more and then at the room, and then he went to the main house, and she heard his steps on the stairs, and then the rain on the roof, and the breathing of tired men, and the low sound of the range. She sat down in the empty spot at the work table for the first time in hours. She was tired. She was very tired. She was also, underneath the tiredness, something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. A specific quiet fullness. The feeling of a day that had spent itself on something that mattered. She let herself sit with it for a few minutes. Then she got up and started breakfast, because the men would be waking soon and they would be hungry, and the bank meeting was in 4 hours, and the work was still the work. The rain had stopped by the time the men began waking up. It stopped the way hard rain sometimes did in Texas. Not gradually, not with any particular courtesy, just stopped, between 1 minute and the next, leaving behind a silence that felt almost loud after hours of noise. The sky outside the kitchen window was still dark, but had changed quality, the heaviness lifting, the clouds beginning to separate in the west, where a thin gray line of early light was showing itself at the edge of the horizon. Vivian had been awake through all of it. She didn't think about that, about the fact that she'd been on her feet since the previous morning, about the specific weight that had settled into her lower back, and the dull ache behind her eyes that came from sustained focus and lamplight. There wasn't time to think about it. The men were waking, and they were going to be hungry, and the bank meeting was in 3 hours, and she had bread to check, and a fire to build up, and coffee to replenish. Danny woke first, still at the work table, with the dried blood on his forehead from the night's cut and a crease on his cheek from the grain of the wood. He looked at her with the disoriented expression of someone who had fallen asleep somewhere unexpected and was sorting out where he was. "Morning," she said. He touched the cloth at his forehead. "Is it bad?" "It's not bad. Clean it again before you go out." He nodded slowly, looking around the kitchen at the other sleeping men, at the gray light coming in the window. "Storm's done?" "Done," she said. He sat for a moment longer, getting his bearings. Then he said, "Mrs. Hale, did you sleep at all?" "I'll sleep tonight," she said, which wasn't an answer to the question, but was the only answer available. He looked at her the way young people sometimes looked at older people who were doing something they couldn't quite account for. Not quite admiration, more like the particular attention of someone storing something away for later, for when they understood it better. She put a plate of biscuits in front of him and went back to the stove. The kitchen filled slowly as the men woke and oriented themselves, moving from the floor to the table in degrees, eating in the quiet way of people who were tired enough that the food was more important than conversation. She fed them and let them sit, and by 6 o'clock most of them had drifted out to begin assessing the storm's damage in the gray morning light, and the kitchen was quiet again except for Alma, who had woken early and was doing dishes without being asked. Wyatt came down at 6:30. He had slept 2 hours, maybe a little more. She could see it. Not enough, but better than nothing. And he had cleaned up and changed and had the look of a man who had decided to be sharp and was executing on that decision regardless of how his body felt about it. He came into the kitchen and she set breakfast in front of him, and he ate quickly and without conversation, which was how he ate when his mind was already somewhere else. When he finished, he picked up the folder of documents she'd left at the end of the table. Everything organized, tabbed, the Ray letter on top as she'd said, the corrected accounts behind it, the record of recovered payments behind that, and he looked through it briefly, the way a man confirmed that what he expected to find was there. "This is complete," he said. "It's complete," she said. He looked at her. He looked like he had something to say and was deciding whether this was the right moment for it. She waited. She had learned in 8 months of Wyatt Blackwood that pushing him toward words before he found them himself produced nothing useful. "When I come back this afternoon," he said, "I'd like to talk. Not about the accounts, about—" He stopped. He looked at the folder in his hands and then back at her. "About what comes next. For the ranch, for arrangements." She understood, in the specific and careful way she'd come to understand him, that arrangements was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, more work than it could comfortably hold. "All right," she said, "I'll be here." He nodded once and went out to the yard, and she heard him call for his horse, and a few minutes later she heard the horse moving out of the gate at a steady pace toward Red Hollow. She stood at the window and watched the gate for a moment after he'd gone. She was aware, in a way she had been increasingly aware for the past several weeks, that the line between what she'd been hired to do and what she was actually doing had blurred so completely that she could no longer find it. She had come to Iron Ridge Ranch to cook. She was still cooking, but she was also managing a household and keeping accounts and corresponding with debtors and holding the ranch together during storms and being the person that tired men fell asleep near and that the foreman consulted and that the owner said, "I knew you were here," and it made it easier. She had not planned any of this, not one piece of it. She thought about what she'd known when she stepped off the stagecoach in Red Hollow 8 months ago. $11.60, a worn travel bag, and the diminished determination of a woman who had survived something hard and was trying to keep surviving it. She had not been looking for a home. She had been looking for a wage. She had been looking for enough ground under her feet to take the next step without falling. She thought about Daniel. She thought about him directly, which she hadn't done in a while. Not because she'd stopped missing him, but because grief had its own schedule, and lately his presence in her mind had become softer, less like an open wound and more like a scar. Something that was always there, something that had changed the landscape, but something you could live alongside without it being the primary thing. He would have found this funny, she thought. The bookkeeping, the letters to cattle buyers, the storm. He would have said that she'd always been better at this kind of thing than she gave herself credit for, which he'd said to her in various forms more times than she could count, and which she had always deflected or dismissed in the easy way you dismiss things said by people who loved you specifically because they loved you. You assumed the love distorted the perception. But she thought, standing at the kitchen window in the gray June morning, that maybe he hadn't been wrong. She went out to look at the storm damage at 8 o'clock because she needed to see it for herself, and because the kitchen could run for an hour without her now that Alma was genuinely capable. The east yard had taken water. A long, shallow channel of mud ran from the corner of the barn toward the gate, where the rain had pooled and run. 2 fence panels on the south side had come down under the wind. The vegetable patch she'd started in March, her own small project, undertaken partly for practical reasons, and partly because she needed something that was purely hers, had been flattened on the windward side, the young plants bent sideways and half buried in debris. She crouched beside the vegetable patch and looked at it. Most of it was salvageable. The tomatoes were gone. They'd been too young and too exposed. But the root vegetables were fine underground, and the hardier things, the beans and the squash, had taken the beating and were still standing, bent but present. Hatch appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him coming. "Garden took a hit," he said. "Most of it will come back," she said. She was pressing one of the bent bean plants gently upright, feeling the stem, still supple, not broken. "The tomatoes are done, though." Hatch crouched beside her with the ease of a man whose knees were not what they'd been, but who crouched anyway. He looked at the garden. He looked at her. "How long have you been up?" he said. "Since yesterday morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Wyatt went to Red Hollow." "The bank meeting. How does it look?" She sat back on her heels. She looked at the garden, at the bent plants and the scattered debris, and the evidence of a hard night that was already, in the clear June morning, beginning to look less catastrophic than it had at 2 in the morning. "I think it's going to be all right," she said. "I think we've done enough." Hatch nodded slowly. He looked at the garden for a moment longer. Then he said, "You know, when you came last October, day you arrived, I watched you cross the yard behind Danny with your travel bag, and I thought, she won't last 3 weeks. She glanced at him. "Wasn't a cruel thought," he said. "Just an honest one. We'd had a lot of people come through. They all left. Didn't see why you'd be different." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong." "Most people are wrong about first impressions," she said. "Maybe, but I've been wrong about fewer people than you'd think, after this long." He stood up, his knees complaining audibly. "You changed this place, Vivian. I don't mean cooked better food, though you did. I mean..." He searched for the word in the way he sometimes did, the deliberate way of a man who wanted to be accurate rather than fast. "You reminded it that it was supposed to be lived in, not just operated." She didn't have a response to that. She wasn't sure one was required. She went back to straightening the bent plants, pressing them gently upright, and Hatch stood in the garden for another minute without speaking, and then walked back toward the barn. Wyatt came back at 2 in the afternoon. She knew, before he said anything, from the way he came through the gate. Not from anything dramatic. He didn't ride in fast or throw his hat or make any gesture that would have been legible from a distance. He just came through the gate at a steady pace, and his posture had a specific quality to it. The quality of a man who had been holding himself very tightly for a very long time and had just, fractionally, loosened his grip. She was in the yard when he came in. She'd been carrying a crate of supplies from the root cellar to the kitchen, and she stopped and set it down and waited. He dismounted. He handed the reins to Danny, who had appeared at the right moment with the effortless timing of a young man who had learned to read the yard's social signals. He came across the yard toward her. "The bank accepted the accounts," he said. "Full settlement by the end of the month. The loans are restructured on terms that are manageable." He paused. "It's done." She let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she'd been holding. "Fallow?" she said. "The bank made it clear they're not entertaining outside buyers. There's nothing for him to purchase." Something moved through his expression. Not satisfaction exactly, closer to the specific feeling of having prevented a thing that would have been wrong. "He was in Red Hollow, as it happens. I saw him outside the bank when I came out." "Did you speak to him?" "Briefly." A pause. "I told him that Iron Ridge Ranch was not and would not be available, and that he was welcome to conduct his business elsewhere in the territory." She looked at him. "How did he take it?" "About how you'd expect." He said it flatly. "He'll move on to something else. That's what men like that do. They're not committed to any particular piece of land. They're committed to the opportunity. When the opportunity closes, they go find another one." She nodded. She picked up the crate from the ground. "Leave that," he said. "I need it in the kitchen." "I'll carry it." She looked at him. He reached out and took the crate from her with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided this was happening and wasn't making a thing of it, and he walked toward the kitchen and she walked beside him. And it occurred to her that this was a small and completely ordinary thing, and also that 6 months ago he would not have done it, would not have noticed the crate at all, would have passed by on his way to the next task without looking up. He came to the kitchen that evening as he'd said he would. Alma had gone to her quarters. The kitchen was clean, the supper things cleared and washed, the range burning low. Vivian had made a pot of tea. She had tea, had bought it herself in Red Hollow on one of her monthly trips for supplies, one of the few things she bought for herself, and she poured 2 cups without asking, because he had stopped needing to be asked about things in his own kitchen. He sat at the work table. She sat across from him. He looked at the tea. He looked at the table. He was doing the thing again, the visible working toward words thing that she'd learned to simply wait for. "You came here as the cook," he said. "Yes, that's not what you are anymore. I'm not sure it's been what you are for some time." He looked up. "I've been thinking about how to say this, and I haven't found a good way, so I'm going to say it plainly and ask you to hear the plain version of it." She held the teacup and waited. "This ranch needs someone to manage the business side of it properly. Not just accounting, oversight, correspondence. The kind of attention to the whole operation that I don't give it because I'm too occupied with the land and the cattle, and I've never been good at the parts that happen on paper." He paused. "I was good at them once before. I had help. After I lost that help, I just let those things deteriorate. You know what that deterioration cost?" "I do," she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to take that on formally, with appropriate compensation, with—" He stopped. "With a different arrangement than cook and employer." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of arrangement?" He looked at his tea. "I'm not good at this," he said, and it was so plainly true and said with such undefended honesty that it was more affecting than anything more articulate would have been. "I haven't been good at this for years. I'm aware of that." "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to stay." He looked at her. "Not as the cook, as my partner. In the running of this place, and—" Another pause, briefer this time, as if he'd decided to just get through it, "and in whatever else you'd be willing to say yes to." The kitchen was very quiet. The range ticked softly. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch continued, Men in the bunkhouse, horses in the stable, the ordinary alive sounds of a working place. She thought about what she'd said to Hatch in the garden this morning, about the plants that bent but didn't break, about most of it being salvageable. She thought about standing at the stagecoach depot in Red Hollow in October with $11.60 and no clear idea of what came next. She thought about the specific kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone. The loneliness of feeling like you were disappearing, like your presence in the world was becoming optional, like you were moving through your own life without quite touching anything. She didn't feel that way anymore. She hadn't, she realized, for some time. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about how things should be done, and I express them. I don't disappear into the background." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to. I'll always be honest with you, even when you'd probably prefer I wasn't." "That's actually one of the things I'm counting on," he said. She looked at him across the work table, across the teacups and the lamplight, and the 8 months of accumulated understanding between them. She looked at him the way she'd learned to look at things at Iron Ridge, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion, with attention to what was actually there rather than what she'd expected to find. What was there was a man who was imperfect and knew it, who had let grief make him smaller for years and was choosing, in his difficult, undemonstrative way, to be larger, who had walked across his own yard and picked up her crate without making it significant, who had said, "I knew you were here," and it made it easier, and had meant it as the most honest thing he knew how to say. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. To all of it. They were married in September. It was not a large ceremony. Vivian had not wanted a large ceremony, and Wyatt had not suggested one. They rode into Red Hollow on a Thursday morning and were married at the county clerk's office, with Greer and Hatch standing as witnesses. And then they had dinner at the best restaurant the town afforded, which was a modest establishment that nonetheless produced a very good beef roast. And then they rode back to Iron Ridge Ranch in the late afternoon, and Hatch made an announcement at the bunkhouse, and someone produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and there was noise from the bunkhouse until quite late, which Vivian considered more than sufficient celebration. Danny came to the kitchen door that evening, slightly flushed from the whiskey, and shook Wyatt's hand with the formal earnestness of a young man performing an important social duty. Caleb, walking now without any sign of a limp except when it rained, came and did the same. Alma cried briefly and then apologized for crying, and Vivian told her there was nothing to apologize for. Hatch said nothing at all. He just looked at Vivian with the expression of someone whose estimate of a person had been revised upward substantially, and she nodded, and that was sufficient. But what she had not expected, what she could not have predicted in October, stepping off the stagecoach with her worn bag and her $12 a month hope, was how completely Iron Ridge Ranch would come to belong to her. Not as a legal matter, as a felt reality. The specific way a place became yours, not through purchase, but through attention, through the accumulated weight of days spent inside it, through knowing where the draft hit the kitchen range wrong, and which gate latch was intermittent, and how the light came through the east window in the early mornings of late summer. She thought about this sometimes in the way she thought about things she wanted to understand properly, turning them over, looking at them from different sides, resisting the easy conclusion. She had not come to Iron Ridge looking for a home. She had come because she had no better options. That was the plain truth of it. She had been broke and alone and 43 years old, and the advertisement for a ranch cook had been the one door that opened when she knocked, and she had walked through it because it was the only door. And yet, she thought about what Hatch had said, that she had reminded the ranch that it was supposed to be lived in, not just operated. She thought about that, and she thought about whether it was also true the other way, whether the ranch had reminded her of something similar. Because the other truth, the one she hadn't expected and hadn't been looking for, was that she had been operating herself, going through the motions of survival, functional without being fully present, moving through the days with efficiency and without joy, which was sustainable as a short-term strategy and was not a life. She had not decided to stop doing that. It had just stopped, gradually, without announcement, somewhere between the ledger and the letters and the early mornings and the kitchen that became the warm center of something larger than itself. She had looked up one day and found herself entirely there, in the room she was standing in the work she was doing, in the place she was. She thought that was the thing nobody warned you about when you were in the middle of grief and survival. and the daily effort of not going under. That the not going under could, if you were persistent enough and lucky enough, and if the right door opened at the right moment, turn into something else entirely. Not what you had before, not what you'd lost. Something different. Something that was yours in a new way, because you'd built it from what you actually were, rather than from what you'd expected your life to be. Mom. In the fall of that year, she planted the vegetable garden again, properly this time, planned it out in March and gave it better shelter and better drainage, learned from the storm what the vulnerable positions were. She planted tomatoes with more protection around them. She planted more of what was hardy. Wyatt found her in the garden one evening in October, the exact month she'd arrived the previous year, kneeling in the dirt at the end of a long day, pressing seedlings into the ground for the following spring. "You're planning that far ahead," he said. "Someone should," she said. He crouched beside her. He was not a man who gardened. He had never shown any interest in the vegetable patch, and she had not expected him to, but he crouched there anyway, looking at the seedlings, in the way he sometimes simply appeared beside her now. "Next spring," he said. "These will come up in March," she said. "If the winter isn't too hard." "What are they?" "Beans mostly, some squash. I'm trying a winter onion this year. I read about it in the back of the cookbook." She paused. The cookbook that was Ellie's. He was quiet for a moment. She had said Ellie's name directly, deliberately, the way she'd decided months ago she was going to when it came up, because not saying it did not make the person less present, only made the silence around them heavier. "She would have liked the garden," he said. "Not with grief, or not only with grief? With the particular quality of a person referencing something that was past and real and could be held without being broken." "I imagine so," Vivian said. They stayed in the garden for a while, both of them, in the October evening that smelled like cooling earth and the far edge of the cattle range, and the stars were beginning to appear in the eastern sky the way they always did out here, the way she had stood at the kitchen window and watched them on her first December night, dense and particular and indifferent to everything below them in the way that the best things often were. She pressed the last seedling in and sat back and looked at what she'd done. A modest rectangle of prepared ground. Some seeds. A plan for a spring that was months away. It was, she thought, an essentially hopeful act. Not optimistic. She had never been especially optimistic, and optimism wasn't what she'd call what she was feeling. But hopeful. Hopeful in the way that people who had survived difficult things sometimes were, which was not innocent or easy, but was real. The kind of hope that knew how bad it could get and chose to plant the seeds anyway. That was what she'd learned, she thought, or relearned, or learned in a new way through a new set of circumstances. That survival wasn't the end of the story. That you could come through something broken and broke and alone and 43 years old with nowhere better to go, and you could cook someone's meals and read their ledger and hold their ranch together in a storm. And you could build something out of the doing of those things that was more durable than what you'd arrived with. Not because the world was fair. It wasn't, and she'd never been under any illusion that it was. Not because loss resolved into something cleaner. It didn't. Daniel was gone. Ellie Blackwood was gone. The boy. The life she'd imagined in Joplin. None of that resolved. None of that became neat. But the people you sat beside, the work you did with your actual hands, the places you gave your attention to, and that gave it back. Those things were real. They accumulated. They added up to something. And what they added up to, if you stayed long enough and paid enough attention and didn't run when the difficulty arrived, was a life that was actually yours. Not the life you'd planned, not the life you'd mourned. The one that was here, in front of you, asking if you were willing to tend it. She was willing. She stood up from the garden and brushed the earth from her knees and stood beside her husband in the October evening, an Iron Ridge ranch spread out around them. The barn and the bunkhouse and the stable, the fencing running out toward the far range, the cattle in the distance, the house behind them with its lights on in the windows, warm against the coming dark. She had come here with nothing. She was not leaving. That, she thought, was enough. More than enough. That was the whole of it.